Hello my beautiful people, welcome back to the channel. On this video I'm going to show you guys how to log your users in or register your users to your application using the phone number authentication feature on Firebase. And this is a 2020 update because a lot of the old code doesn't really work well now. So I hope you guys are excited because I'm going to teach you how to do that, how to manage the authentication using the provider package, and also how to use shared preferences to take care of your user authentications. If you guys are excited, I am excited. Let's go straight to it. Hello beautiful people, welcome back to the channel. If you saw my last video, you're probably familiar with this screen here, the screen you're seeing. And on this video, I'm going to teach you guys how to implement one of the features I had on my previous app, and that is the phone authentication using the provider package, right? A lot of you guys asked me to do this, like detailed explanations of certain components of the app, and today I'm going to do this. Let's go. What we have here at the beginning is basically a simple structure. This is only the UI. All of the back end code was removed from the app, and I'll have the link for the starter template, for this initial template, on the description section, so you can go and download that or get the source code on GitHub. After you get the source code, you're going to have a project with a file structure exactly like this. Let me just take a bit of time to just do an overview of what we have here. We have one folder which is called helpers, where we store all of the essential files that help us do some tasks. For the first one, this is a helper that will make it easy for us to change screens. Instead of writing navigator.push all of the time, we'll just call this method and pass the widget. We have here one called styles, where we have defined some colors so that we will automatically call the colors by the variable name. We have the helper called users, which is empty, and this is empty because it's essential for our project, and we will write the code for this helper here, but this will handle services related to the user. We have models, which is where we have the database scheme for our user, or the scheme of our Firebase collection. The file is empty for now. We will fill all of this together. And we have the auth provider here. Then we have the home screen and the login screen. Then the remaining are just widgets that are created on different files to avoid repetition, right? With all of this out of the way, we can start working right away. Another quick note, this project is already connected to Firebase. I will not show you guys how to connect your projects to Firebase on this particular video, because I believe that you already know that. And if you don't know, I have a separate video where I teach you how to connect your projects to Firebase. I can leave the link in the description or something. But this is already connected to Firebase, so sorry. What you can do is you can copy this structure of the project, and paste it into a different project, and connect your project to Firebase and all of that. And another side note is that when you're connecting your project to Firebase, remember on the authentication tab to enable phone authentication, because if you don't enable phone authentication, none of this is going to work. Good. That was a lot of talking. Let's get straight to the action. And the very first thing that we are going to work with is the models. And again, as I told you, this is basically the database scheme. We are creating a file which will create a model for our data. As simple as that. And the very first thing we are going to do is let me zoom in so that you guys can see, and I'll explain you as we go. We are going to import here Cloud Firestore, obviously, because we are creating a database schema for Cloud Firestore. And then our second step will be to create our class called user model. And then now we're starting to define some constant variables, and these constant variables are basically the names of the fields of our Firebase Firestore collection. So we'll have number, and number will store the user number, phone number. We have the ID, obviously the user ID. The Bluetooth address we are not going to use on this particular project. And the close context. These two are not required, so we'll get rid of this too. Nevertheless, we have here our phone number, our ID. Again, you can forget about this too, but we are going to create two private variables, one called number and one called ID. And of course, we'll need some getters so that we can access the values of these variables. And what is being done here is these variables are private, only usable inside of the user model class. But if you want to read or access these values from outside this class, that's why we are using these getters. So we have string get number when we are getting the value of the private variable called number. Now we are going to create a constructor named constructor that's going to take our document snapshot as a parameter, and then we are going to populate some values. Let me make all of this code better by eliminating what we don't use. And again, I only have this because this was the structure on my previous project, but this is not required for what we are building now. We only want to know about the authentication. So I'll get rid of this. Getting rid of this. And we're good to go. This is good enough, and we already have our model for our users collection. And again, these are the names of the fields that we're going to have on our Firestore collection. We're only going to store the phone number and the ID. On your project, obviously, you can increase this. You can store the name of the user, the email, the image, whatever you want to do. But here we are only going with the essentials, which is the number and the user ID. And then we are creating two private variables, number and ID, and getters to access the values of these private variables. And then we are creating a named constructor, which is going to take the document snapshot as a parameter, and we are assigning the values that we are going to read from this to our private variables here, right? We have our user model populated, and we are good to move. Now, the second thing we are going to work with here is our user helper. And this is going to deal with basically all of the services directly related to the Firebase database and the user. I'm sorry. I have a cold, so I'm sorry. So I'm going to zoom this a bit. And we have here our Cloud Firestore, and we're importing the models obviously as well. And then we create our class, and the name of the class is user services. Okay. Then we are defining the name of the collection that we are going to be working with, and in our case is the users. The collection on Firebase is going to be called users. Then we are creating an instance of our Firebase Firestore. And here we have our first method. Our first method, it's called create user, and it's self-explanatory. The purpose of it is to create users, and we are going to take one parameter of the type map, having the keys as strings and the values as dynamic. And basically this means that the keys are always going to be strings, but the values can be integers, double, and lists, all of that. And then the first thing we are doing inside of our method is creating a local variable called ID, and from the map here we are going to read a value ID and assign to our private our local variable ID. And then we have here our final line of code, which says Firebase firestore.collection collection. And if you see collection basically mean user, and so we are doing firestore.collection users, because this is what we are working with, document ID, and we are taking this ID and placing here set data and values. So what this is going to do is, on our collections called users, it's going to create a document of the ID, this ID we passed here, and set values to the values of the map. This is basically all. Our second method is going to be update user data. We are not going to be using this on this particular project, but this is important and you always need this on normal projects. So again, the structure is basically the same. The name of the method is update user data, and we are taking a map. Then what we are doing here is firestore.collection. Again, we are doing collection users for the document with the ID called values.id. And see how now we did this directly. It's not compulsory that you assign the value of this ID key to a separate variable and then put it here. You can just write this directly here. Dot update data and values. So we are basically saying on the collection called users, we want to look for the ID, this ID, and we want to update the values to these new values we are passing here. Great. And our last method, it's going to be called get user by ID, and we are going to use this method to get the user, and it's going to return a feature of the type user model, obviously, and we just created this model. And now we have here Firestore collection. The structure is basically the same, document ID get. Now we want to get we want to get on our collection an ID of this ID we are passing here as a parameter. Then docs is basically the response or the result we are going to get from this code we are going to call that docs. One thing we are doing here, first thing we are checking if that exists. So we are doing doc.data is equal to null. So if nothing is returned, if the document has no data, we are going to return null. Basically means that the user doesn't exist on our database. And the second thing, if the user does exist, we are going to return user model dot from snapshot. You remember how we created this this named constructor, and doc. And you can see here that doc is of the type document snapshot. And if I click here, this method here, doc is the type of document snapshot, and we are going to assign that to the values of these private variables. So this is basically what we need to do for our user services. So we are halfway there, because we have here our user models done, we have our user services done. Now we just need to work with our provider structure, and once the provider is done, we are going to set everything on the main file to make sure that our app knows about the existence of these providers, and we are going to pass these values to the login screen and all of the other screens. Okay, let's continue. So guys, continuing now, we are here at the auth file, and this is inside the providers directory, right? And now we are going to start to work with this, and this is kind of the more complex section of this tutorial. because we are going to have a lot of code here. So I would recommend you guys to pay close attention to this particular portion of the video. Anyways, the very first thing we're going to do here is import some files, and we are going to import a bunch of them. Starting by importing our dart.async, since we are going to be working a lot with asynchronous methods and future. And then we need to import from our helpers the screen navigation. This is going to be useful because we want to have the ability of changing from screen to screen here inside of our provider. We are going to import the helpers user because we are going to use that as well, and the models users as well. From the screens, we need the home and Flutter material.dart as well. Flutter widgets. We need to import our Firebase authentication, obviously, because the whole purpose of this provider is to deal with authentication, so we need that import as well. We need to use shared preferences. I don't know if you guys ever work with this, but shared preferences basically will allow us to store some data locally on our device. This is extremely handy and useful. And now we are going to create what we call an enum enumerator, and this enum is kind of a custom data type, and the values that are assigned to our enum status, which deals with the user status, is the initialized status, authenticated, authenticating, and unauthenticated. Basically, initialized, ideally we are going to show the splash screen, meaning that nothing was initialized. The unauthenticated, if the user is not authenticated, we want to show him the login screen. The authenticated, we want to show him the home screen, and and when it's authenticating, we want to show some widget that will display a loading icon or something. And then here we have our class. We are going to call our class Auth Provider with change notifier, and this is basically a mixin, and I've talked about this on previous videos. Mixin means that this class is going to use some methods from the change notifier, but is not a child class of the change notifier. It's not inheriting nothing from it. It just uses methods. These comments, which are not very useful. Now let's start working with our local variables. First, we have our Firebase auth. Obviously, we need an instance of Firebase auth. We need a Firebase user. We are going to use this quite a lot. The status, at the beginning we are going to assign the value of initialized when we first open up the app. We want to import our user services. If you remember, we created this file inside of the helpers user. We need user model, and we need a text editing controller called phone number, and this is going to be passed to our text field, and we are going to get our phone number from here. String SMS OTP, which is going to contain the value of the OTP sent to the user's mobile device. Verification ID, and this has to deal with the authentication as well, the authentication process. Error message, which is going to be empty, but we will populate this variable when we do get an error. We create one boolean called logged in, which is false at the beginning, and we create another one called loading, which is false as well at the beginning. Now for our getters, we will do a user model for the user model to get the user model data. We are going to do one for the status of the user, and one final for our Firebase user, which is important as well. And now another thing that we are going to need is a constructor, named constructor. So we will create one named constructor called auth provider.initialize. And again, you can call this anything you want. And the very first method that we're going to get is called read refs, basically standing for read prefs, basically standing for read shared preferences. So what we want to do here, the approach we want to take is the as soon as we open up the app, we want to go and read the shared preferences and get some data from there. Now what we need to do is to go and define this method. So guys, now we are going to provide our definition for the ref preferences. And side note, I have some background music and hopefully you're not able to hear that because that's my neighbor. I guess he has a party or something. But okay, going back to the video, we're going to define now the shared preferences method. Let's go straight to it. So it's going to have this structure, and basically what we are doing here is we are defining our shared preferences to be of the type feature void. Basically it's going to be asynchronous, but we are not really going to return nothing from that. And the first thing we are going to do inside of this is run this piece of code that looks a bit complicated, but what we are doing here is basically await future.delay. Then we are giving a duration of 3 seconds, and then we are going to execute something. What's the use of this? The delay method, the future.delay, basically it's like we are telling the app to kind of wait for 3 seconds before we execute what's inside of this statement. And this is useful mainly when you want to show a splash screen at the beginning of the app. So while you're delaying this piece of code for this 3 seconds, we will be displaying our splash screen, and after the 3 seconds are done, we are going to execute whatever method we have inside of our future.delay. And again, the syntax is future.delay, and in here we have the duration of 3 seconds, and then we are going to do something which is asynchronous as well. The first thing that we're going to import is the shared preferences, and we already have this package on our pub/spec file, so you don't need to import. But if you don't, just go to Google Flutter shared preferences, and the first link you're going to get is for this package. So what we are doing, we are getting an instance of the shared preferences. We are calling it prefs, and it's a future method. That's why we need to place await before we call our shared preferences .instance. Good. Continuing. Now here we have our logged in. If you remember, we defined this variable here at the top, logged in, which by default is false. So what we are doing is logged in is equal to prefs.getBool. GetBool means that we are trying to get a Boolean variable that it's supposed to be stored in our shared preferences, and the name of the variable is logged in, right? So what this piece of code is doing, these 2 question marks, we are checking if in fact exists any key with the name logged in or stored on our shared preferences. And if this is null, means that we never defined nothing called logged in, we are going to assign our logged in as equal to false, right? Continuing. Now here we have another piece of code, which is if the logged in is already if the logged in exists inside of our shared preferences, and if it's true, now we want to do something else. The very first thing we want to do, if the logged in is true, meaning that the user is logged in, we want to get that user. So we will do user is equal to await of Firebase authentication dot current user, and this is going to return an object of the type Firebase user. And in here we have user model, which is going to be equal to await user services dot get user by id user dot uid. And if you remember, we defined this on our helper. Then notify listeners, which is basically letting all of the listeners know the new values. Sorry. The new values of these variables. And then we return nothing. Basically, this is like exit. We are saying that once this is done, okay, you can stop execution of this method. This is not required. And this is basically it. Now let's continue with our logic. So guys, let's continue building more methods. And the first one we are going to build now is intent to handle errors. So let's do it. So here we have the name of the method is handle error. And it's going to take two parameters, one called error and another called build context. And basically we are giving build context as one of the parameters because we may need this method to display something on the user's screen. That's why we are giving the context. So the first thing we're going to do is print the error so that we can see what's happening. And then we are going to assign error message, the string version of the error.string. We are going to assign that to the error message. And if you remember, we did define this at the top. Then we want to notify these changes to our listeners. Now we have this part of the code which basically we are doing a switch statement. And the first case that we are checking is if the error or the type of the error is invalid verification code. And on these cases, we're basically going to print the verification code is invalid and break. And by default, we're just going to assign the error message to the error message variable. So that's basically it. And notify this to listeners. This is what this function is going to do, this method. Now here I may need you to pay some close attention. Here we have the method verify phone, right? And is of the type future. And we are going to take two parameters, the build context and the phone number that we are trying to verify. The first statement that we have here is phone code sent. And basically what we are doing here is, well, we are checking if the SMS OTP was sent. And this method or this variable is going to take a method which has two parameters, one called string verification ID and one first code resent. And we are going to get this automatically. I will show you where actually we are going to use this, and probably you're going to understand it better. So now here we are calling something called SMS OTP dialog. And probably after you define this, you're going to get an error. After we define our SMS OTP dialog, we're going to get an error. Why? Because this is an alert dialog, and as for the moment we didn't create this we haven't built, and we are going to do after we're done defining this method. So you just write this and probably going to get an error, but it's okay. So what we are going to do is, after we call, or when we call this SMS OTP dialog context.then, we're just going to print sign in so that we can see that the alert dialog was called. But we are going to get an error again because we didn't define it yet. Now in here we are going to use the try statement because there's still a couple things we need to do. And inside of our try, the very first thing we are going to do is call this method, which is called auth.verify phone number. And this is what we use when we want to verify phone numbers. The first parameter that this method is going to request is called phone number, and basically is the phone number that we are trying to verify. And here we are going to pass number.trim because phone number is a string, and we use .trim to eliminate white spaces after and before our string, just to make sure we are playing on the safe side here. And now here we are getting something called auto retrieval timeout, and basically our app will have the ability of automatically getting the code once it's received by the device, but we want to define a timeout if we don't auto retrieve the code until this many seconds. Do this, right? And now what we are going to do here is basically, when we get the code, and this is going to resend or send us something called the verification ID, we are going to define this verification ID, and when we're doing this verification ID, we are giving reference to this verification ID at the top here. So once we get our SMS with the OTP code, we want to get the verification ID assigned to the value of this variable called verification ID inside of our class. Continue. Code sent. Again, code send is going to be SMS OTP send, and if you remember, this is basically this here at the top. So for the code send, we are going to call this method that we define here. Timeout basically is, if you have used, obviously you have used apps like WhatsApp, once you're waiting for the OTP, you have, I guess it's 60 seconds for you to get the code, or you can resend. You can click to resend the OTP. So here you can define anything you want, depends on your app basically, but on our case we are going to do a timeout of 20 seconds, and if you do not get the code in 20 seconds, you can click to resend the OTP, but you can do it a minute, 2, 5, depends on what you want for your project. Continuing, and here we have verification completed. And what this is going to do, basically we are going to define what's going to happen once our verification is completed. And for our case, once the verification is completed, we are going to get something called auth credential, and in this particular case is the phone number authentication credential, and we just want to print that to make sure the verification is completed. So here we have a print statement, which is going to call our auth phone auth credential dot to string, and this is going to print to our console whatever the information we have here. And in case our verification is failed, obviously we will need, again, we'll call this method, we are defining the method, we're not calling it, it's going to be called automatically. We are passing, that's right, we are passing the method called auth exception. And basically we are going to print exception dot there was a typo here, exception, but whatever, exception dot messages plus something is wrong. And if our verification is not running the way it was supposed to, we are going to get this exception on our console, and we will be able to troubleshoot it from this point onwards. Good. And finally here, if you remember, we defined a try, and every time we have a try, we have to have a catch, meaning that if we do have an error on our try statement, we want to do this. First thing, we want to call our handle error, pass E, which is the error, and the context. And if you do remember, on our verification method, we get the context as well. So we are calling this method here at the top called handle error. We are passing the error and the context. And then we want to do error message is equal to e.string, which is the error that we are getting. And finally, we will want to notify listeners about all of this change. I know that this is a bit complicated, and feel free to stop the video, review the code, and try to see if you understand everything. And if you don't, just ask me questions on the comment section below. Feel free to do that. Now, what we are going to do is actually defining this SMS OTP dialog so that this error will go away and you guys will understand what we are doing here. So guys, let's continue building our methods, and even before we build our dialog box or our alert dialog, we still need to build a couple methods in between. So let's get straight to it. So the very first method that we are going to create here is the create user method, and it's going to take a map with two values. It's going to take two named parameters, not a map. Two named parameters with two values, ID and number being the user phone number and ID being the user ID. And this is going to create the user on our Firebase file store, because by this time we already have the user on our Firebase users list, but we do not have the user on the file store, and this method is going to do exactly that. And it's simple. We're just going to call user services.create user, and if you remember, we did create this method which takes a map, and we are passing here a map, and the values for the map ID is going to be the ID we are going to pass, and the number is going to be the number representing the user's phone number. We have this method done. Now let's continue. Now we are going to create another method for the sign in, which is going to take only the build context, and it's going to be an asynchronous method. By making this async, we're basically saying that this is a future void. You don't really need to write that here, but it's there. So we are going to start with a try statement, which is a good way of starting your methods. Error handling first. So the first thing we're going to do here is final auth credential. Credential is going to be of the type phone of provider dot get credential. Right. So this is the first line, and here we are basically trying to get the credentials. And we have here the verification ID going to be equal to verification ID, and we have created this variable at the top, and we have the SMS code being equal to SMS OTP. We created both of these variables at the top. So we are going to get the credentials for this verification code and this SMS ID that the user is going to pass. Now here we have our auth result, which is going to be user. We will do auth sign in with credentials, and we are passing this phone auth credentials. Then we are doing here Firebase user. The current user is going to be equal to auth.get current user. And the assert is basically making sure, right? We want to assert that our user.user UID, this one, is equal to our current user's ID, this one. And we are going to call our loved shared preferences because we need to set some values now. Now on our shared preferences, we are going to set our logged in key is equal to true. The user is logged in. And we are going to set the variable logged in equal to true as well. And in here we are going to make sure that if the user is not null, and don't forget to put 2 G's here, the keys must be always equal. But we'll take care of this. I'll show you a better way of handling this. Anyways, we are going to check if the user is not null. And if the user is not null, we want the user model to be equal to user services.user by ID, and we are passing the value user.user.uid. If the user model is null, meaning the user was never inserted on the database, we are going to call our create user. And this is basically the method we defined at the top, and this is going to insert this data into our file store. And we're going to set loading equal to false. We will call our navigator.context pop, and then we are going to change our screen to the home screen. We define this method change screen replacement on our helpers. And we are going to notify our listeners. Catch, obviously. And if we do have an error, we want to print that to the console. Now, to kind of wrap things up, we still need to call our SMS OTP dialog method, which is a future boolean method. And it's going to return a show dialog, because this is a alert dialog we're dealing with on the present context. That's why we're getting the context here as the parameter. Bearer dismissible, we are going to put false. Builder, and we are going to call here build context. We are going to pass the context, and basically this is going to mean that we want to display our alert dialog on the present context, right? Because we are passing here the value of the context. Oops. And in here we are returning our alert dialog, and the title is enter SMS code. This is what's going to be displayed on the alert, and the content at the beginning at the upper level is going to be a container. We are going to define a height of 85, and we are giving a height of this container because we will be using a column inside of this alert. And if we do not give a constraint such as a height, we are going to have an error. So you need to define a height, sorry. And the child of this container is going to be a column, right? Inside of our column, we need a text field. And every time the value of this text field is changed, we want to make sure that the SMS OTP is equal to value, because this field is where the user is going to be entering his OTP. So every time the user types something here, we want this variable SMS OTP to be equal to what the user types. And we are going to provide content padding for our alert dialog being equal to 10. Actions. This is a bunch or a set of buttons that we are going to use on our alert dialog. And for our case, we are going to use a flat button. We're going to call done. Once the user has completed entering the OTP, he's going to click or press this button, done. Now we want to define our unpressed, or if the button is clicked or pressed, what's going to happen. Make sure that this is asynchronous, because we will deal with some synchronous methods here. First of all, we are going to define loading as being equal to true, because we are loading something, and we want to notify listeners about that. Now here we are going to define another we are going to call auth current user, then, because we want to deal with the user, the active user now. We are checking if the user is null, right? If the current user is not null, sorry, we are getting our again, we are getting our user services get user by ID, and if user model is null. So what's going to happen here, I'm repeating this code because if for whatever reason the user gets into the alert dialog while he's only signed in but we do not have the user details on the database, we want to make sure that we will always record that. So once this is done, once we check if the user model doesn't exist on our database, we want to create that. We want to insert the user ID and the phone number to our database. We are going to call navigator.authContextPop, and this is going to close all alert dialog and set loading is equal to false. Let the listeners know, and we are going to change to the home screen. And this was what we defined if the user is not null. If for whatever reason the user is null, we're just going to put loading is equal to true, and we are going to pop. Basically, we are going to do nothing. We're just going to dismiss our alert dialog and call the sign in method because the user is not signed in. And this should be false. And again, coming here at the top, we are basically something we still need to do here to improve is coming at the top, and now we are going to create a static constant. Oh, sorry. Logged in, and we will call this logged in. And what this is going to do is instead of us manually writing this key on our shared preferences, and sometimes we may commit some typos and that would break our code, we are just going to pass here the value of our constant. So here we are basically playing at the safer side, if we can say it like that. Let's look up for places we use that. Sorry for my flu. And I think that this should do. Yeah, this is good enough. Okay, let's continue to implement other methods. So guys, now we are going to kind of wrap things up, but we still have to do some modifications here on our main file, and then after that is done, we are going to add this code to our login screen, and after that we'll be able to test, right? But it shouldn't be nothing super hard, because for example here on our main file, what we need to do is, let me zoom in. Get rid of this, and we're going to call here multi-provider. Multi-provider needs a list of providers, and we're going to call change notify provider dot value, and here we will call auth provider dot initialize. Right, now our application knows about the existence of this provider, and we are calling the constructor at the very beginning. let me do some modifications here that I think are important. I believe now that we better set this to null at the beginning. And now going back to our main, second thing that we need to do here is we need to call a child for our provider, and on our case is going to be my app. Good, this is good. Now here inside my app, instead of automatically calling or manually calling the login screen, I will uncomment this. And don't worry if you do not understand, because we'll get rid of everything inside of this and we'll start from scratch. So we are getting rid of this. Good. And we are getting rid of this. So now what we are going to do is to complete the logic in here. And I guess we need to delete this. And the function of this screen controller is basically defining which screen are we going to return to the app based on some criteria. But the very first thing that we need in here is to have our final. We'll call it auth, which is going to be a provider. Dot of context, and in here we'll pass our auth provider, which is good. Now what we want to check is if our auth dot logged in this is what I want to check. Else if our auth dot provider dot logged in is not true. So the first statement will check if our auth.logged in is true. The second statement will check if it's not true, and the else will check for the cases where this is null. If this is true, if our user is logged in, we'll need to return home. So if the user is already logged in, we'll return our home screen. If the user is not logged in, we will return our login screen. I think that there's no need of doing this. We can just do something like this. We'll return our login screen. And this is basically it. Now let's go back to our auth provider. No. open up the wrong file. Okay, auth. And now we already have all of this defined, right? We have here all logged in, which gets the reference with a bit of delay. Let's do something quite interesting. The status here is uninitialized. Okay, good. And on these cases in here, if the user is logged in, we'll change his status to authenticated, and if the user is not logged in, we'll place his status as status equal to unauthenticated, and we're going to notify listeners. Good, this should do. Now let's go back to our main file. Nope. Main file. Here we have our main file. And what we are going to do here is basically copying this. And then we'll check if auth status is equal to unauthenticated, and then we'll place an else statement here, where we are going to pass this. As a matter of fact, here should be uninitialized. And when we are doing uninitialized, we are going to return, we'll call it splash, which unfortunately we do not have no more our splash screen, but we can define it here on our main. Which is going to be a stateless widget. Call it splash. A scaffold with a white background color. And a body of the type column. Here we're going to place the children, main axis alignment, center, and a circular progress indicator. This should do. Well, usually you don't want to put any code, UI code, inside of the main file. The splash screen should be on a different file, but I'm just doing this for the sake of simplicity. Right? And now, here we are going to call this guy our screen controller. And finally, a last thing that we'll want to do now is going to our home, and here at the very top, we are going to do something like let me copy this variable and paste it in here. Good. Now what we want to do is inside of our column auth.loading, and if it's loading, you know what, I think that we should remove this from here. Let me get rid, oops, I'm talking about the splash screen actually. I think I better get rid of this so that I don't complicate things for you guys. So let me get rid of the splash screen. Let's just create another screen in here, which is going to be a new Dart file. We're gonna call it splash. Where of course we'll need to import Flutter material.dart, and then we paste this. We go back to our home and import that class from here. This is not needed anymore. So that now here, when we are checking if something is loading, if it is loading, we can just return splash. And import it. And one final thing that we'll want to do here is here for our onClick method, we're going to do auth dot we need what we need is not verification ID. We need to verify our phone number. Let me open up our auth provider and see how we call that method. We're gonna call it verify. Oops, this was extremely wrong. I defined the verified method inside of another method, and that shouldn't work like that. And even the method to handle the errors shouldn't be defined here. Just remove it and place it outside. That was a huge mistake. Hopefully you guys didn't do the same thing I did. Anyways, verify phone number, this is how we're going to call this. And right here where we click on verify, we want to do auth dot verify phone number. We're passing the context, and here we are passing number dot text. Okay, this was a lot, but this should do, and this is the code that you need to have in place in order to have your app working the way it's supposed to. Now what's left for us to do is to test the app. So guys, once everything is set and done, once you have written all of the code that you have to, this is what you are going to end up with. And now I'll just put in a test phone number, and don't forget to place your country code. Done, and hit on verify. And now we will be waiting for the SMS, and we just got it. I think it's 98. Oh, sorry. And the SMS code is 98, 90, and 81. Let me just double check it. Okay. We will be having some processing, and I was supposed to place something here to show that to the user that we're loading. I think I forgot that, but whatever. After the authentication is complete and all of the loading is done, this is why you're going to have basically a home screen with the logout option to log the users out. So this is basically it. I hope you guys enjoy it.